I'm Victor Pacheco, and I'm one of the main organizers of the event, along with Professor Laura Zaha and Professor Mariana Boccarini. I would like to thank you all for being here. So, and also, this is a very special moment for me because it's my last symposium as a PhD student. So, it's very good to be here and at home, and especially here in this historic building. So I'd like to thank the Center Maria Antonia for having us here today, and Alcani as well. I'd like to thank the Embassy of Ireland and the Consul General as well and the ESP program. So today we have a lot of activities planned, and I would like to invite you to take up Consul General Robert Jackson and the artist Rita Duffy, please.
I'm not touching around. So far the microphone technology is working, so that's a good start. Firstly, thank you all for being here this morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here as we celebrate 35 years of the Association of Irish Studies in Brazil, as well as 15 years of the WBH chair at the University of Sao Paulo. The Department of Foreign Affairs, where I work, is proud to support the important work of the chair through our Immigrant Support Programme. I wish to thank Professor Laura Zaha, the WBH chair, and Professor Mariana Boccarini, chair of ABEI, for their kind invitation to join me this morning. Even before the symposium began formally, this morning, pre-conference events have already served to showcase Irish art and literature at the highest level. Hearing the work of Catherine Phil McCarthy on Friday evening, live in both English and Portuguese, thanks to the work of Dr. Giuseppe Wolkoff, was deeply moving. Having the opportunity to see the work of our guest speaker this morning, Rita Duffy, was enriching and thought-provoking and provocative. Rita is both innovative and socially engaged. While here in Sao Paulo, she's had the opportunity to meet with people from many backgrounds and cultures. Professor Zara told me that while she was stuck in traffic, Rita's been studying the many evocative and provocative murals which grace the walls of this city. I think I would hear the creative crossword in the very late while we were having dinner, and Rita was examining the various different elements printed on sugar packets, putting them into different orders, trying to come up with different ideas for them. So I look forward to the sugar packet series at some stage, though I'm terrified what I'm going to do. Please don't listen. Rita is the first visiting professor to Latin America and is joining us as part of a three-country project involving the chairs of Irish Studies at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Universidad de Sao Paulo, and the Universidad Nacional de La Pampa, Universidad de La Plata, and Universidad de Salvador in Argentina. Later on this evening, Rita will be travelling on for the third part of the tripod of this series to join our colleagues at the Embassy in Buenos Aires to learn from Argentina as well and bring the richness of what she sees down there to her work. Some of you, I hope, will have already seen some of the works inside. They're making you think, making you rethink, challenging you, looking at things from a completely different perspective. If a sugar packet can become an inspiration, the entire visit here and conversations I've been having with Zita will show you the rich cultural heritage that this country brings to bear as well. And I look forward to seeing what it's going to do, provoke, and inspire in Rita. So, Rita, over to you.
Robert. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to Laura and everyone who put together the hard work and has created this symposium. I'm proposing to, hold on, We had some technical glitches, but I think we're on the far side of them. I'm proposing to show you a series of work that I selected from a career of 35 or more years. I started out life in Belfast, and it was a very interesting place to begin as a visual artist. The title of this talk is Neither Here Nor There, and I quite like the idea. The phrase kind of is indeterminate and refuses to kind of land in one territory or another, and I think that's kind of, for me, the space where art becomes, really kind of springs from. A sense of confusion. Kind of growing up in Belfast, obviously there were very definite opinions on either side of division, and more recently I left Belfast and we bought a little bit of the border, and I now kind of work from a Calvin and Fermanagh, from an either or sort of position. This is my overgrown studio in Ballyconnell, which is an old courthouse. And I remember Seamus Heaney talking about how important it was to begin to start from the place that you are, the idea of kind of to firmly root yourself at the beginning of source. And as I kind of kept that idea in my head over the last 35, 40 years, I realised it's kind of an anti-colonial strategy to believe that where you are is a place worth contemplating, a place worth exploring. And certainly for me, in one short lifetime of work, it has been very interesting. When I think of divisions, this painting, I'm kind of starting at one of the more recent paintings, and I'm taking you back to the beginning again, just to confuse you and to make sure you stay with me. This painting was called Partition, and a lot of the work that I made quite recently for a big exhibition in the Crawford Municipal Gallery in Cork was to do with kind of the circus, the sense of kind of this strange world that we live in. But when I think of partition, I'm kind of drawn inwards to think of the divisions within myself, the left and right hemisphere of the brain, the light and shade of a pencil line, the border between you and I. Obviously, coming from the north with a northern Catholic father and a southern Catholic mother was a kind of a double indemnity. But we did have the good fortune of living right beside the Ulster Museum. So that became my playground, that became the place that I went to for the world of imagination. Not that they had any incredible paintings, unlike some of the collections here in São Paulo, but it was like all of the kind of little artifacts that had been gathered and kept in a fairly reasonable regional museum. It was an amazing place, and that's where I kind of, I suppose, began to form as an artist. And if you give people the opportunity to be creative, quite often they respond positively. Belfast was a place that obviously was suffering from the legacy of colonialism, and when I was around 12, the trouble started, so it became a place that was really kind of tearing itself apart. This painting called Siege was made after a trip to Derry, which is in the northwest, one of the kind of first locations of the plantations of Ulster, a walled city where there was a kind of a very definite inside and outside. We'll come back to that city later, but the paintings were all very classically painted on oil paint on gesso. Second siege painting was made when I returned to Belfast. And Belfast still has these dividing lines. I look at this painting and I see the similarities. Someone kind of described Belfast and the current issue, kind of divisions between community as really the narcissism of small difference. These people of the same religion suffer the same deprivation and division, and yet there's a sense of kind of separateness. And this is something post-peace process that I believe, as an artist, it's very important that we address, and the arts are an amazing way of creating a third space where people can choose to enter and become kind of enchanted, confused, and a little bit unsure of exactly what they believe in, and possibly decide that maybe what they believed in before is kind of ready to be altered somewhat. I think we win more hearts and minds through intellectual engagement, through compassion and empathy, than ever bombs or bullets could do. In the 80s, I made a very large series of drawings because I was going to the root of where I was, trying hard to kind of look at what was going on around me and to be honest about what I was seeing. These drawings were influenced by George Gross, Otto Dix, painters in Germany after the First World War, and I was passionate about drawing. It was kind of my first language, way I kind of think. On the right hand side, it's a kneecapping and punishment beating. On the left hand side, it was made as on the 20th anniversary of British troops on the streets of Belfast. And I remember in art college, my painting tutor asking me why people were wearing black armbands. And it wasn't that I was overly politicized at that time, but I remember thinking, this man has lived in Belfast for 15 years. He's from London, as most of the lecturers in the art school were. And he doesn't realise that the first hunger striker has died. And that was a strange kind of revelation, that you could actually physically live somewhere, but emotionally, mentally, culturally, be totally elsewhere. I was seeing the other side of the colonial headspace, where everything important was coming from London, and you couldn't possibly create anything in Belfast, or in Ireland for that matter, that would be of any kind of significant relevance. And I remembered the poetry of Paddy Kavanagh, that epic poem where the Duffys and their neighbours were fighting over a ditch, and somehow it seemed very relevant that he used that poem and a fight over a bit of the boundary of a field in Monaghan and compared it to what was going on in Munich at the time. And I think that if you are able to connect significantly with the local, with the personal, it speaks to the universal. And those drawings I really wanted to go to the Ulster Museum as a collection, but unfortunately the Ulster Museum were not of a mind to collect work that was being made about what was going on around us in Belfast, so they ended up, a significant portion of them ended up in the Imperial War Museum in London, which is very prestigious, but I would have preferred all of them to have gone to the Ulster Museum. Here we have Mother Ireland on the left, Mother Ulster on the right, and I grew up with this kind of long-suffering, overburdened female as an iconic figure. My mother and her 5 sisters, there was a kind of a sense of matriarchal strength. These are not without a touch of humour, and it's kind of, it was sort of not something one did in visual arts, to use humour or irony perhaps, but humour was kind of shied away from because it wasn't cool. And I decided I didn't really want to be a cool artist, I just wanted to be my own artist. Segregation on the left-hand side, where children are separated and sent to state schools or religious schools. On the right-hand side, the comfortable woman who lives in South Belfast and has all the advantages of a prosperous livelihood, whilst the troubles affected mostly people in the hardline working class areas. This is a painting called Emerging from the Shamrock, and it was inspired by Anne Crilly's film Mother Ireland. Now, Mother Ireland is a wonderful documentary film if you ever get a chance to see it. It was commissioned by Channel 4, and she was requested to make 11 cuts in the film because of the government legislation at the time on not broadcasting the voices of Republicans. However, in that film, there was a little snippet of archive footage from the very first Rose of Tralee festival, and this was kind of a beauty contest set down in the southwest of Ireland, in Tralee, when Ireland was being marketed internationally, mostly to Americans, as the kind of beautiful colleen, and they should come visit. Anyway, this here in this image, there's kind of an awkward woman kind of walking through a wobbly cardboard shamrock, which was actually what I saw in the footage, and the scores being kind of given by army generals on either side. I created this something on the scale of a wall mural because I didn't want to make wall murals in Belfast that locked people in to kind of previous divisions. I wanted to make images that were about how women were positioned in Irish society, how I felt myself as a woman in Irish society. So on the left, you've got a hunger striker, there's a schoolgirl, there's a swimmer, and there's De Valera with a kind of a version of the Tara Chalice. On the right-hand side, there is this sense of religion. So you've got state on one side, religion, church on the other, and of course, the four babies, one of which Ulster with the hand aloft. The hand is the symbol of Ulster, and they're all about to fall out of the bath water. I'm trying to operate two computers here, so these paintings are Banquet and Settlement, and basically I started to look at the whole coloration and that whole sense of springing from the local to the global. Now certainly the coloration in these paintings, these are very big paintings, they're in Queen's University. The coloration speaks much more to a landscape of the Middle East than it does to the grey skies of Ulster. But on the left-hand side, there's a table and chairs, possibly the negotiation table, possibly the family dinner table, where those attitudes and ideas about equality or inequality, prejudice, bigotry, religious hatreds are handed down from one generation to another. On the right-hand side, there's a little kind of corrugated row of seedlings, and the fortifications were very much in keeping with the army barracks and the security stations that I grew up with. In fact, there was one in West Belfast that the local people called Fort Jericho. The walls did fall down eventually. It's now a very thriving industrial business plan. The idea of an army watchtower captured my imagination since I was a child, passing through those army observation posts going from north to south. And after a poetry reading in South Armagh, I had this idea that possibly we could turn one of these army posts into a work of art. And I floated the idea, this was the beginning of the peace process when they were decommissioning, the army were leaving, or starting to kind of leave, and I floated the idea, wrote it up, and kind of managed to pitch it to the Northern Ireland office, not known for its creativity, but they did listen, and the next thing I got a phone call from a Colonel Wayne Harbour, phoned me up and asked me, in a terribly chipper British accent, which watchtower would you like? And I immediately said, I'd like to look at the main watchtower on the Belfast-Dublin Road, and cordially I was invited to fly by helicopter in South Armagh to the hill where this watchtower was. And I have to say, it's probably one of the pleasanter helicopter rides that the British Army gave private citizens in that area. We got behind the palisade fencing, and Colonel Harbour announced that it was very important to look good from the outside, but basically it's quite theatrical. None of the fortifications were of any kind of strength other than the little billet box at the top, into which I stepped. And I don't know if you can see here, whether you can see here, but the word South is printed above the window. Perhaps if we hit those lights, you can see there. Yeah. Anyway, South, North, East and West were printed on the four sides of the fortified cubicle, presumably to reassure a 17 or 18-year-old squaddy from Birmingham which direction he was facing. And those mountains in the background are the Cooley Mountains, where Cuchulainn, the ancient warrior of Ulster, protected Ulster from marauding Irish hordes. So there was always that division, there was always a separateness, and I would argue Ulster has always been the most interesting area of the island of Ireland. Conversations. Art for me opens up perhaps with a sugar packet, perhaps with a conversation with somebody that you've just sold a painting to. And I sold a painting to an RUC detective. I think it was probably the first RUC person that I'd ever actually had a conversation with. And when he was leaving, he suggested if there was ever anything I needed to give him a shout. So I quickly asked for access to a couple of AK-47s, and I think a bottle of whiskey changed hands, and I was presented with 2 AK-47s and a guardian that stayed in the room so that I didn't leave with 2 AK-47s. But I cast a model of these, and I transformed what had been in use in Belfast into an artwork that I call Dessert. I cast the weaponry in chocolate. Chocolate takes a very good impression, and I first presented this for exhibition in London at the Institute of Contemporary Art, where everybody looked at it and immediately was overcome in some Latin American way with the olfactory senses kind of set on fire by chocolate. They only smelt the chocolate. And it was very interesting. A few months later, I showed the very same piece in the study hall in St Dominics, where I went to school, as part of the West Belfast Festival, in an old Victorian cabinet that looked quite funereal, and people from West Belfast kind of queued up and looked closely, and in hushed tones read the serial number and asked, where did she get that? It was very, very interesting seeing things that had such a different context as everything. For most of my life, I've worked in Belfast on public projects and on studio-based projects. Belfast was not the sort of place where you could really base a painting career, and as a way of making my income. I worked within different communities, creating projects. This was a project for a tower block on the Lower Falls called Divis, and it was a very kind of iconic, very badly built housing block on the Lower Falls that kind of I passed every day on the way to school, and there was a British Army checkpoint on the roof. So I suggested making a portrait of everybody that lived in the tower block on a small piece of linen that was like tea towel size, and on the opening night we put all of the portraits into the window on one facade, and all of the residents switched on their lights, turning the tower block into a lantern. And the tower block is now, I think, one of the few, if maybe the only public housing project in Europe with its very own art collection through the stairwell. The Thaw project. In 2010, there was a suggestion, Belfast was bidding for the European Capital of Culture. There was a suggestion to rebuild the Titanic, and much in all, I think that would be interesting. I believe a good artwork should open up the narrative. We should focus on the ending and kind of create new opportunities or new possibilities for how the narrative moves. And I was always interested in the iceberg, and I figured that that narrative was a huge kind of cloud that kind of hung over Belfast. The Titanic was built there, and to me the iceberg represented the frozenness and inability of people to communicate with each other, especially after 35 years of violence. And Dante talked about how the deepest descent into hell was to be alive but unable to think or unable to feel. And to me that kind of spoke to the trauma, the aftermath of all of the violence that we lived through. And it was also a way of connecting up this huge kind of global narrative to what is the most important thing on our planet today, which is climate change. And even though I didn't succeed in bringing an iceberg to Belfast, sometimes the things that you try to do and the things that don't happen are often the things that you learn the most from. I mean, I suggested building that watchtower becoming a peace monument on the border. At one stage it was almost going to happen, and then the Celtic Tiger died. But sometimes projects that come, you bring them as far as you can. And certainly in the Thaw project, it continued to pulse in my work. Titanic is the third most recognised word on the planet. The first two presumably are Coca-Cola and Pepsi. So it is quite a significant kind of way of bringing global consciousness to an issue that we must address and address rapidly. But I'll move on. The way I actually used this kind of concept of Titanic was to go to Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilders who built it, and purchase one set of drawings. I had to reassure them that I wasn't going to rebuild the Titanic in my back garden, that I was an artist, and that I wanted to kind of work repopulating the Titanic drawings with imagery from the streets of Belfast over the last 30 years. This is a drawing of about 35 feet long, but you'll see there are similarities with the kind of intense detail and some of the work that's in the exhibition. There were lots of other projects that I pulled together, and okay, so this, it's hard to show you detail. But there were little scenarios that I took from newspaper clippings from all sorts of places. And that kind of street culture in Belfast was predominantly the visual culture of murals, unlike in São Paulo, where there's a complete variation of murals side or the other. And they're also, it's quite a macho attitude towards art making. And I value my own individual voice too much to try and kind of engage with that. This, however, was a mural that I made with the Shanghai Women's Centre, and it's a reinterpretation of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. This time, Jesus is a single mother, and there's a whole collection of women who came, incidentally, not just from Belfast. There are a few Southerners in there, and there are people from outside. So it started off as kind of a way of empowering young women in the Shankill, in the loyalist area of Belfast, and it became something else. We also have Miriam McCracken to the right of Jesus, and she's on her mobile phone preventing slavery from coming into the port of Belfast. So there's a lot that women in Belfast have to be proud of. Here we have a piece of work called Raft. It was made in connection with a group of young men living beside my studio on the border, made during the time of Brexit. It's a reimagining of Gercoult's Raft of the Medusa. And this time we have the contents on the raft. We have the ingredients for Irish stew. There was a kind of an ongoing conversation about Brexit and the woes and the wherefores, and what it would mean for people living on the British border in Ireland. But as we know, we managed to get through it. I'm kind of conscious of time, so I'm going to skip along here. Drawing. This is a huge drawing. I made a series of this work when I went up to the Norwegian Arctic to research icebergs and ice. There's a kind of an entire kind of subtext going on with this image. And I actually was awarded the Chinese Cultural Olympic gold medal for this drawing for Ireland, which was quite a surprise because I think it was the first time since Jack B. Yeats that they actually awarded these things, probably because it was an expensive thing to do. However, my interest in textiles, my mother was a weaver, and I've made also a whole series of work to do with garments. This is called Relic. It was the parka jacket that Mairead Farrell wore in Armagh Women's Prison. I painted it as a haunting because I couldn't decide what way Mairead Farrell's legacy would go down in history, and I was interested because she was around about the same age as myself. We went to schools that were right beside each other. Obviously I chose a creative path, and Mairead chose a creatively otherwise path. I watched a little clip of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay on television and realised the orange jumpsuit that I wore in the studio had kind of similarity, significance with the people in this camp in Guantanamo. I titled this Guantanamo Amount, and I put the jumpsuit on a hanger in the studio with a question mark at the top. Garments, sewing, knitting was always part of the culture of women in Ireland. Certainly it was in our house. And my mother, who was from a little village in County Offaly, Clara, and who had been swept away to Belfast when she married my father, she was a great iron sweater knitter. We lived in a predominantly Protestant area, so there was no sense of your Irish culture having any expression. But all winter she would fervently knit away the iron sweaters. And on the 11th of July, when my father had his holidays from the aircraft factory, we got into the car, like the Clancy brothers, and escaped south. And this was her subversive way of telling the neighbours that we had a cultural identity. And even though it was kind of woolly and soft and a very gentle way of expressing it, it was still a sense of subversion, that subversive stitch that she focused on for her family all winter. This is called Exodus. 2013, I was commissioned to make a project in Derry for the Derry capital of culture, and Derry was built on the labour of women making shirts. All of the shirts for the army on either side of the American Civil War were stitched in Derry. There wasn't a single tribute to the labour of the women who worked in those shirt factories and who then went home to make dinner. I created a shirt factory that employed 6 women. I made a whole series of drawings about what was in the city, what was going on in the city. It's always my first kind of port of call when I'm researching something. I made a book with Paul Muldoon with some of these drawings. He had been commissioned to write an opera for the London Guilds. And together we produced a shirt factory that had things that you could buy. I designed things recycled out of shirts. We produced a manifesto every few weeks, sent them all around the city. Karl Marx mentions the mechanisation of labour in his manifesto, and he mentions the shirt factories of Derry. So I thought this was a really good way of publicising and engaging and drawing in all the older women who had worked their lives in the shirt factories and gathering their stories. We made a product called Be Special Honey, and my good friend Margot Harkin, who's a terrific Derry woman, assured me that this wasn't funny. I probably shouldn't be doing this. And I said to her, it's really important, Margot, this isn't just about being funny. This is about using humour and going to territory that we need to untangle. The Be Specials were a group of men who were particularly violent towards the nationalist or Catholic community, and I wanted to take the bitter taste of history out of our mouths. So hey presto, Be Special Honey. On the left-hand side, I used some of the archive material from the shirt factory to highlight the politics of moving the garment industry from reasonably well-paid Derry to Bangladesh, and God knows where it is now, for cheaper and cheaper labour. Of course, we had to, this was the home or the beginning of the civil rights movement in the north, and there was a poster. I got an image of the very first poster that had been produced. We digitally reproduced it on textile and used the front of a man's shirt to create the civil rights march cushion. The project later went to the Mattress Factory Museum in Pittsburgh, and the Civil Rights March pillow met with the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream pillow, because they were very influential, both of the civil rights movements. In 2016, I was commissioned, I got one of the national commissions for the centenary, so I cast my gimlet eye on all things that had happened over the last 100 years since the 1916 rebellion in the south, using the same methodology of creating products out of things that we already recognise, but having a political, artistic, ironic twist. In all, we had something like 56 products, including a whole range of horticultural seeds, small posters. Here we have, on the left, the Rise Up baking soda, Reach for a New Republic, the notion of somehow the wanting to change society doesn't always have to be bloody revolution. On the right hand side, obviously, we have the black and tan shoe polish. I work with the Irish Countrywomen's Association, who I regard as the true warriors of Ireland. They take produce from the land and turn it into nourishment in many ways. On the right hand side there is shaving cream, and it's for the love of Ireland, turn the other cheek. So, and this is the Son sticking plasters. I made these for the project's iteration in Paris. My grandfather was killed in the Battle of the Somme, and I quite like the idea of the irony of kind of an envelope of sticking plasters for small cuts on your finger being used in connection with, at the time in Paris, there had been several horrendous attacks, and the true belief that there is no such thing as heroicism in war. My grandfather died, he was 32, and his family of 4 children and his wife were burnt out of their house in 1921 for living on the wrong end of the street. So even dying for king and country doesn't assure you of a roof over your head. Unite Ireland sewing kits, make your own Markovich, these are self-evident. But the idea was to engage people and to create souvenirs that were artworks, that were affordable, and we had a very successful project. I'm now on to a series of drawings which you can see in the exhibition. I was making work after I had switched off the radio during COVID, listening to what was happening in America. It seemed completely depressing, and I started to make this series of work instead of listening to the kind of cycle of news. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in darker territory that we had perhaps hoped to avoid. Those drawings led to these big paintings, and this is a triptych. This is the land part of triptych: land, sea and sky. The painting is, these are very large paintings. On the left hand side there is a kind of a white narrative. On the right hand side there is an African American narrative. This is called this was made after the attack on the White House on January 6th. This is called Sailing Belfast to Byzantium, inspired by Yeats's poem. This is a ship crossing the Atlantic. On the lower deck you can see kind of a myriad of people being taken from the colonies, or from Africa across to the colonies. There's a whole strata of society. You can see these images better on the website because they are very, very detailed, and it's very hard to kind of describe. There's some, you can see some stuff here. Look, there's an Amazon office with a man kind of delivering boxes out to various places. People on board the ship were kind of climbing up and down through the kind of the levels of the strata. On the right hand side there's a kind of an Abu Ghraib shadow of a man, a hooded man, and underneath the people trafficking that went on continuously across the Atlantic, and the idea of travelling because you're starving or you're living. Ornithopter. The flight element of the triptych, and this was loosely inspired by the exit from Kabul airport. Coming now to the end of the thing, I've probably run well over time, but my final slide is an interpretation of the Irish flag. Cabbages, parsnips, carrots. To me, if there is no nourishment in our nationality, in our sense of who we are, if there's no responsibility in how we act, then what point is there in having a flag? And finally, I want to kind of read a little piece from Arundhati Roy that I think, in terms of what we're living through at the moment, what we're witnessing on our television from Gaza. The piece goes, "The only dream worth having is to dream that you will live while you are alive and die only when you're dead. To love and to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power. Above all, to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and to never, never to forget." That's the people of Gaza. Thank you very much.